Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. It doesn't take long when thinking about ethical questions related to the dead before you get into some quite weird metaphysical territory. You can start off from some fairly intuitive premises, and then set off following them to their logical conclusions, and find yourself somewhere you really didn't expect to end up quite quickly. That's why they're philosophically quite interesting, as I hope will become clear from this conversation with Joseph Bowen. Joe is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Leeds, specialising in moral, political and legal philosophy. As well as whether the dead have rights, his research focuses on the nature of rights and directed duties, the justifications for and constraints on harming, the nature and scope of duties to rescue, and just war theory. Okay, so I'm here with Joseph Bowen. So Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, great to be here.
And we're here today to talk about the question of whether the dead can have rights. So I suppose I thought it might be useful just to kind of set the scene a bit and ask, why does it matter? Like, why is this an important question that we should be interested in?
Yeah, great. I think that's a great place to start. So one reason why it matters is rights are thought to be an especially weighty consideration when you're thinking about moral and political discourse. So take the philosopher's favourite transplant example, where the doctor's about to operate on a patient, right, realises the patient is a match for 5 other patients who are going to die unless they get some organs. Yeah. And so the doctor can kill the patient or can allow the patient to die on the table and then harvest the organs and give them to the 5 other patients and save the 5 other lives. Yeah. Even though there's a sense in which it would be better were the doctors do this, because then 5 people would live rather than 1. It looks like it's wrong for the doctors to do that. Right. And this is generally thought to be explained by the fact that the patient has a right against being used for the sake of saving the 5. And so in this way, rights are thought to impose side constraints on promoting the good, or supposed to trump consequential considerations, or supposed to give you exclusionary reasons not to take other reasons into account. Right.
Yeah, thinking about kind of organ donor examples, I suppose that does show that there are kind of ordinary ways of thinking which do tend to imply that people have rights, because it's not that we think once somebody's dead, you can just be free to use their organs however you see fit. Right? Yeah. That's why we have donor cards, because we think that even after somebody's dead, they might, well, it appears like we think of them as having a right to object to that.
And so because if the dead do have rights, then as it seems when it comes to donors, they certainly do. Right, this is going to give dead people a weightier protection than they otherwise might have if they weren't to have posthumous rights. Mm-hmm. But another reason, maybe the more interesting reason, concerns what's the relationality of rights. So if I hold a right, for example, that you not harm me, this doesn't mean merely that you're under an obligation or a duty not to harm me, but you owe your duty to me, the right holder. Your obligation is directed towards me, the right holder, such that if you were to violate my rights, you wouldn't merely act wrongly, but you'd wrong me, the person to whom you owe the right. Yeah. And so if the dead hold rights, well then we don't merely act wrongly, say by failing to satisfy their wishes or by defiling corpses or things like that, but we'd wrong those people who died, the right holders. Yeah. So it matters whether the dead hold rights, because this is going to affect whether or not we're capable of wronging the dead, I think. And that's to me, I think I've got firmer intuitions on whether the dead can be wronged than if the dead hold rights. And it seems to me that you can wrong the dead. So that's one of the reasons I was interested in this question.
Okay, good. So one of the questions I was going to ask is whether, because I suppose one natural move to make would be to say, well, it's a bit weird to think that the dead can have rights, but we do think that living can have rights. So maybe what we're actually concerned about is the rights of living people, perhaps those who care about the person who's died, right? So in the kind of
organ donation case, maybe what we really care about is the loved ones of that person who's died, right? And that we might be wronging them or infringing their rights in some way if we don't respect the wishes of the person. But you think that doesn't quite get...
Yeah, so for this reason, to do with the directionality and the relationality, that's why I think this explanation doesn't fully seem to work. Because if it was the living that held the rights that you not treat their loved dead ones in certain ways, or that you not respect their loved ones' wishes, well, then you wouldn't be wronging the dead people, you'd be wronging the living. But that doesn't strike me as the right fit. So take a case, so Kafka wanted everything he left behind when he died to be destroyed. And this included the trial and the castle. They were just manuscripts at the time. And his wishes weren't respected. Now, whether or not you think that was, all things considered, the right thing to do, you know, maybe the trial and the castle are so important that perhaps Kafka's wishes shouldn't have been respected. I think there's still a bit of queasiness about that Kafka didn't want these works out there.
Right.
And that queasiness that I feel for Kafka, for me, seems to correspond to the idea that I think that Kafka's been wronged here. Even if it was, all things considered, permissible. There's still some hang-up there.
Yes, there's still something that needs to be taken seriously there. In terms of Kafka and his kind of rights and interests.
There's another reason I think it maybe mightn't make sense to say that the rights we think we might owe to the dead are actually the rights that we owe to the living, and that's to think about what happens if there's someone for whom no one cares. If they don't have any loved ones or any relatives, then it looks like there's no one to whom we owe it to treat that dead person with the respect we think we owe to the dead. So one way to reply to that might be to say something like, well, you know, if I found out you can do whatever you want with someone who's died for whom no one cares, then that would make me uneasy because, you know, perhaps I'm going to be one of those people for whom no one cares. Hopefully not, but perhaps. So perhaps that's why we ought to act as if the dead hold rights, because this practice gives everyone peace of mind. But practices are pretty robust, and, you know, it's unclear how my failing to respect the wishes of the dead person is going to erode the practice of respecting the wishes of the dead person. Taken to the extreme, you know, if you find yourself presented with an opportunity where you can fail to respect the wishes of the dead person and no one's going to find out, that's not going to have any effect on the practice. And so it would be unclear in those cases why it would be wrong there to fail to respect the wishes of the dead. But if the dead hold rights, then we've got a ready explanation for that.
And we should be looking for something like that because that makes sense of intuitive ways of thinking about these practices and so on. That makes sense. Okay, so on your view, being a candidate to have rights, being the kind of person or entity that can have rights, sort of depends on having interests. Is that right? What's the relationship between rights and interests?
So I think the nice way into the way I like to think about rights is to think about some of our most important rights. So, for example, our rights not to be killed, our rights against grievous bodily harm, against torture, serious sexual assault. Why is it that we hold those rights? Well, one thought is that, you know, it would be awful for me were you to do any of those things to me. Were you to murder me? Were you to subject me to grievous bodily harm? And so I think a natural thought then is, well, because it would be so bad for me were you to do those things to me, that's why I hold rights that you not do those things to me. These are really important things for me that you not do. And so it's because of that that I hold the rights. So that's, I think, a nice way into thinking about this connection between rights and interests. So some people, me among them, think that interests exclusively ground rights. So these people endorse what's called the interest theory of rights.
So that's, just to clarify, so that means that that there's no other way of having a right other than on the basis of some interest. Is that what you mean by exclusively ground?
That's what I'm thinking there. So there's different ways to cash out what that connection between interests and rights is to be, but the general thought is something like For you to have a right is for you to have a sufficiently strong interest that can explain why that right exists, that can ground that right. But I think even if you don't buy this view, it still matters whether a potential right holder is an interest bearer or not. So let me say a bit about why I think that is. So some people think that the control that rights endow us with is what makes it the case that we hold rights. Rights makers, in H.L.A. Hart's terms, small-scale sovereigns, with that over which we have a right. We get to control that bit of space that we hold a right to. I think a natural question there is, well, why does control matter? And I think the answer is, well, control matters because it's important for us that we get to control things.
Yes.
Right? It's only because we get to control things that we get to promote our autonomy, that we get to lead the lives we want to lead. But then if someone isn't an interest bearer, if it doesn't matter for them that they get to control things, well, then I think we should raise the question, why would they be a rights bearer? If I say to Alexa, you can control my schedule for the next week, don't let me cancel any appointments without your say-so, then there's a sense in which Alexa is now a small-scale sovereign with respect to my schedule.
Right.
But it seems weird to say that Alexa has a right that I not cancel my appointments there. And I think part of that weirdness there is that, well, it doesn't matter for Alexa that she controls my schedule.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. Just one further point on this. Presumably, having an interest in something is not sufficient for having a right with regard to that thing, right? So there's plenty of things that I could have an interest in, but I don't have any right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have an interest in winning the lottery tomorrow. It doesn't mean I have a right to win the lottery.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So having a really weighty interest isn't going to be sufficient. It's just there's different ways to go, but one way to think about this is if your interest is sufficiently important to explain why someone else is under a duty to do the thing that you've got an interest in, well, then that's when it's not merely the case that they've got a duty to do it, but you have a right that they do it. And so the reason that I have a right that you not harm me, but I don't have a right that you not harm someone else, is because it's not important to me that you not harm someone else.
Right.
Whereas it is really important to me that you not harm me. It's my interest that explains why you've got this duty not to harm me. So that's why it's my right.
Okay, great. Okay, so in order to have rights, it looks like we need to have interests. So if we want to know whether the dead can have rights, we need to know if they can have interests. And then the kind of third concept that you bring into this argument is well-being. So how do interests relate to well-being?
Yeah, great. So this is a frustratingly under-theorized question. I think it might be one of these things where it's more of a verbal dispute. So on the view that I like, interests just consist in our well-being, where our well-being is what makes our lives go well for us. So there's a huge literature about well-being. What is it that makes our lives go well for us? And I think we could just piggyback off this and say, well, our interests consist in our well-being.
Right.
Other people disagree and they think our interests come apart from our well-being. So Victor Chandros, in a book called Wrongs and Crimes, gives us an example of why this might be. He says, I have an interest in not being paternalistically interfered with. But paternalistic interference, for it to be paternalistic interference, needs to promote my well-being, needs to be good for me. So how is it that I can have an interest in not having my interests promoted?
That's interesting.
So he wants to pull them apart a bit, where sort of our interests are going to be more to do with like what we have a stake in or what we want to control or something like that.
Right. I suppose my immediate response to that might be something like paternalistic interference needs to have the intention to promote our well-being, but it doesn't necessarily need to actually promote our well-being. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what makes it paternalistic, is because people are trying to do it for our own good, not that it necessarily is.
Yeah. And similarly, I think one thing, if someone paternalistically interferes with me, while they might succeed in promoting my well-being. They have frustrated a different aspect of my well-being. They've sort of taken charge of my life. I'm no longer autonomous with respect to that bit of my life that they've interfered with. And so I think we can explain these cases away by saying, well, what happens with this paternalism case is that they might promote some part of my well-being, but they frustrate another part of my well-being.
Yeah.
It's in virtue of frustrating that other part of my well-being. I've got this interest in them not paternalistically interfering with me.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So, in order to have rights, the dead need to have interest. In order to have interest, they need to be potentially the kind of entity that can have well-being. That's where we've got to. So that's great. So, all right. So, what's well-being? What different views have philosophers taken on what well-being is?
Great. So views of well-being tend to be distinguished between three different types of view, three different families of view. So hedonistic theories of well-being say well-being consists in pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So hedonists then can disagree about what pleasure consists in, what makes something pleasurable. So internalists about pleasure say all pleasurable experiences share this pleasantness to them. Externalists about pleasure say, no, pleasurable experiences need to be associated with some pro-attitude, say that you want the experience to continue.
Right.
You desire the experience for its own sake.
Okay.
So that's hedonism, the first view.
Right.
The second set of views are desire theories or preference satisfaction theories of well-being. They say well-being consists in the satisfaction of our desires. So like the hedonists, they then have debates among themselves about what desires matter. Is it all my desires? Is it only the desires that I would have were I fully informed and were I rational?
Right.
Is it only desires I have about myself, or is it about desires about third parties also? So that's the desire theory.
Okay.
And then the third theory is called the objectivist theory of well-being. And that says well-being consists in the advancement of certain aspects of my life, regardless of my attitudes towards those aspects. That's why it's an objective theory in a sense. And so then objectivist theorists disagree about what things to put on the list. People tend to include things like being a morally good agent, developing my abilities, being in caring, loving relationships. Some people include knowledge on that. You can tell the philosophers are the ones that are making the list. So that's the objectivist theory.
Okay.
And then you can have pluralistic theories that bring different aspects of the different families of views together. So perhaps it's desires, perhaps it's pleasure that I desire to continue, things like that.
Right, okay. So there can be some kind of mix. Great. So I wonder what our listeners are thinking about those different kinds of theories. I wonder if some people might be thinking, well, it's obvious that it's just about kind of being happy or being, experiencing pleasure, isn't it? That's when I think about well-being, that's what the kind of thing I think about. So why might somebody doubt that a hedonistic theory, a pleasure-centered theory, is a good one?
Great, yeah. So the usual objection to hedonism is that it just seems that things can be good or bad for us without us experiencing those things being good or bad for us. So on hedonism, it wouldn't be bad for me for you to break into my house tonight and plug me into a super-duper experience machine. This example comes from Robert Nozick, where once I'm plugged into the machine, I'm going to have really pleasurable experiences for the rest of my life. I'm going to be in loads of relationships that I experience as loving. I'm going to experience writing that Nobel Prize winning piece of literature. I'm going to experience climbing Everest.
Right. This is the kind of the Matrix sort of view, I suppose.
And so this is when the desire theorist enters, and she says, "Oh, what's gone wrong there with hedonism is that you don't. It's not merely good for you that you experience these things as good or bad for you. what you actually want is to do these things. What you actually want is to be in a loving relationship, not to experience being in a loving relationship. You want to write the book. You don't want to experience writing the book. You want to achieve climbing Everest. You don't want to experience climbing Everest. And so they say that's why it's not the experiences that matter, the pleasure, the avoidance of pain. It's the satisfaction of your desires that matters. And whether or not your desires are satisfied depends on the way the world is, whether the world conforms to your desires.
Right, okay, yes. Good. So the reason why you might reject the hedonistic view on the basis of that thought experiment is that if you had the experience of, producing some kind of artistic masterpiece or whatever it is, your desire would not actually have been fulfilled, right? Insofar as the desire is to have produced a masterpiece rather than just to desire experiencing that. And actually it seems like plenty of people do have desires that go beyond just experiencing certain things, and therefore we ought to think that what matters really is the actual satisfaction of those desires rather than the experience of that.
Yeah, another way to put it is to think about suppose you find out that your spouse has been unfaithful, or your parents worried about you, have paid all your friends to pretend to be your friend, and you find out about it. It'd be really bad to find out about it, but I don't think, on reflection, we think it only became bad for you at the point at which you found out about it. Yeah. It was always bad that my spouse was being unfaithful to me. It was always bad that my friends weren't really my friends. And that suggests that the fact that my desire wasn't being satisfied, the desire for existence, that explained why it's bad for me, not merely my experience of it.
Yes, okay, good. And what about the objective list theory? Why might somebody favour the objective list theory?
So the objective list theorist presents something of a Euthyphro dilemma.
Okay, you're going to have to explain what
to the desire first. So they say, think about these desires you've got. Is it really the case that you think getting these things would be good for you because you desire them? Or is it rather that you desire them because they think these would be good things for you? Is it really that it's good for you to be in a loving relationship because you desire to be in a loving relationship? Or do you desire to be in a loving relationship because you think it would be good for you to be in a loving relationship? And the objective list theorist presses, it's the second thing, right? You desire it because you think it would be good for you. But what this suggests is it's not the desiring of it that makes it the case that it would be good for you. Rather, it's the thing itself that's good for you. And you desire that because it would be good for you. And so they say our view can accommodate that, because we say there are things, the advancements of which are good for you, regardless of your attitudes towards them.
Right.
There's this collection of things. What's on our objective list? That's what's good or bad for you.
Yeah.
And we can explain why you desire stuff that's good for you, because you're desiring stuff that's on the objective list.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, there's just no way of making sense why one might desire something without already having an idea of what's conducive to one's well-being as the thought. Yeah. Great. Okay. So which of these accounts do you prefer then?
So I like the objective list theory.
Okay.
I think when I reflect on why I desire things, I think I desire them because I think those things would be good for me. And this sort of suggests that that's the right way to go with it. Now there are worries with the objective list theory. What is it that explains why these things are good or bad for us? But I'm willing to try and tackle those questions in order to help.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So we've gone quite a long way from the original question, but I guess just to kind of recap where we are, we think that in order to be a candidate for being the kind of thing that can have rights, the dead are going to have well-being, and then we've just kind of gone into what we think well-being might be. So given that view and given that kind of territory that we've covered, how can we make sense of the idea that the dead have well-being then? Because that seems like a weird proposition in the first place.
So yeah, so I think if you're tempted, despite everything I've said, to hold on to the hedonistic theory of well-being, then the dead can't have rights.
Right.
That seems pretty obvious, right? The dead can't experience things as pleasurable, and so they're not there as a well-being. But think about why I said we should move from hedonism to the desire theory or to the objective bliss theory. I said, well, it seems that things can be good or bad for you, even though you don't experience those things. It's good or bad for you. And those things can be good or bad for you if you're a desire theorist, because you've got desires for those things. Okay. And they're good or bad for the objective bliss theory, because they're the sorts of things, the advancements of which is good for you. Once we recognize that move, I think it's tempting to think the dead must have well-being, must be there as well-being. And this is because the desires we have can, and this is because the desires we have are likely going to extend our lives. Right? I don't merely desire that, I write some good philosophical work that's engaged with by my peers. But while I'm listening, I don't desire merely that I write some good philosophical work that's engaged with by my peers. While I'm alive, I desire that it's just engaged with generally. And so that desire can be promoted or frustrated after I die, just as it can be promoted or frustrated while I'm living. Similarly, with the objective list theory, lots of the things that fall on the objective list can be advanced or frustrated after I die. I think this might actually press us towards thinking about well-being. There's a real question here. Okay, if it doesn't matter to me on the desire theory or the objective list theory that I ever experience the satisfaction of my desires, or that I ever experience these parts of my life going well. Well, then, why would it matter that I no longer exist?
Right, exactly. So I think you use, I think maybe you're quoting another philosopher in the paper, but you talk about, I might have got this example wrong, but, there's somebody who's maybe spent their whole life producing their philosophical work, and then just as they've kind of dotted the final I and crossed the final T, they drop dead. And then, somebody comes across the manuscript or whatever it is and destroys it. It looks like, firstly, it's strongly intuitive to think that they've been wronged in some way, right? And that their well-being has been interfered with, right? And that can only make sense if we decouple well-being from experience in some way, because their experience is no different from if the same thing had happened, but then that manuscript had been published and, been really successful.
Great, right. So that's an example from Jeff McMahan.
Okay.
He says, he gives the case exactly he gave it, and says, look, if it's destroyed just before I die, I never know about it. That's really bad for me in the desire for the objective list theory. But if it's destroyed the moment after I die, and I can't be posthumously harmed or benefited, that's not bad for me.
Right.
But this timing seems a bit arbitrary here. Which suggests, it must be that we can be posthumously have our well-being posthumously promoted or posthumously frustrated.
Right. Yeah. Is there any way for somebody who wants to hold on to the link with experiences to do so? I mean, so if you still have the intuition, well-being kind of must have something to do with our experiences. Is there any way of kind of rescuing this link between well-being experiences and making sense of the idea that the dead can have well-being?
So lots of people have tried to do this because they have the intuition you can't be posthumously harmed or benefited. And so the way to do this, it looks like, is to introduce an experience requirement that even if you don't need to experience these things as being good or bad for you, perhaps you still need to be someone capable of experiencing things, or perhaps you need to be someone whose experiences can be made worse by the fact that your experiences are now false.
Right.
Your experience, you think your partner's in a loving relationship with you. It turns out that's a false experience you're having. It's a non-veridical experience you're having. But once you're dead, then obviously you're no longer having experiences.
Right. So the idea is that the experience becomes non-veridical because you're experiencing something as being X, but actually X doesn't obtain. So like you're in the kind of matrix type examples, you're experiencing the world being a certain way, but the world is not actually that way. So your experience is affected not in its kind of subjective quality, but in whether it does or does not track reality.
This is Cécile Fabre. This view.
Okay.
It seems to be strange. I can't really understand why that would be the case. It seems what I really care about isn't, that I have a veridical, a true experience. Being in a loving relationship, but I'm actually in a loving relationship. I don't want to experience being in a loving relationship that turned out to be true. I just want to be in a loving relationship.
Yes.
And so I think there's this real question of how plausible this sort of experience restriction is going to be with the idea that we're designed to explore objectivist theories. How well can you motivate this restriction to try and stop posthumous harm?
Yeah. I think one of the reasons this question is so interesting is because kind of whichever way you go, you end up with some quite weird conclusions, right? So it's kind of like, well, okay, it feels weird to think that people who don't exist anymore can have rights or can have interests or can have well-being, and therefore let's try and make sense of the idea that they can't, but then you end up, with some kind of equally weird conclusions, really.
And there's a very closely related question, which I think is going to have implications on what we want to say here. So, while there's some disagreement about whether it seems the dead can be harmed or benefited posthumously, things can go well or badly for the dead. There's more agreement that death is bad for you. That when you die, in your prime, this future ahead of you, that's really bad for you. That you're no longer going to get to live out the rest of your life.
Right.
But of course, at the point at which you die, you no longer exist.
Yes.
This is the Epicurean challenge to the balance of death.
Right.
And so how can death be bad for you if you're no longer around to experience that thing being bad for you?
Yeah.
And so, to the extent that I think lots of us have the view that our death will be bad for us, or that our death could be good for us, right? If our death's going to prevent us of suffering, then we're going to need to accept that there's some weirdness going on here. Things can be good or bad for us, even though that doesn't affect our experience, even though we don't experience them as good or bad. And so taken together, I guess this gives us more reason to just embrace this weirdness.
So we kind of, embrace the lesser weirdness in a way is the way to go. Brilliant. So is your conclusion then that the dead can be the kinds of, that the dead can have rights?
So bringing it all together, began by saying something like, rights are related to interests, such that if we've got really weighty interests in something, then we might potentially have a right to that thing in virtue of having those weighty interests. And then said, it looks like the dead have these interests and can sometimes be quite weighty. I don't so much about that, but we often care a lot about what happens to us after we die. And so to the extent that it looks like the dead have interests and rights, protective interests, it looks like we ought to accept the conclusion that the dead can have rights based in they're having interest in certain things happening to them or not happening to them after they die.
Great. So Kafka did have the rights for his manuscripts to be destroyed. The fact that they weren't destroyed was an infringement of a right, regardless of whether we think or told it was the right thing to do.
Kafka was wrong. Interestingly, Adam Smith, the author of the Royal Nations, also issued that all this work being destroyed up.
Oh, really?
And that was destroyed.
Right.
I think it was a book on philosophy of law. So just think all the dissertations that could have been written on this unfinished manuscript if only it happened. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Okay, so I just have one more question, really, and I don't know what the answer, what kind of answer you might even give to this, but when thinking about these issues, I often find myself wondering whether the more accurate description here is to say that the dead have rights, or the dead have interests, or the dead have well-being. People who are dead have those kind of qualities or whatever. Or to say that when they were alive, they had those things, right? So when they were alive, they had a right that such and such a thing happen. And when those rights are then infringed posthumously, what's happening is they're kind of retrospectively being harmed in some ways. I mean, it's one of these things where, again, it is a weird conclusion because it has that weird kind of chronological kind of aspect. But is it more accurate to say that the dead have rights or the living have rights which can then be retrospectively infringed after they die?
Yeah, great. I think it's a really great question. Well, I still don't know exactly what to say about it. I think one thing to begin by saying is that it's certainly the case that, on my view, the dead hold rights in virtue of having desires, having certain aspects of their life that could be advanced or frustrated when they were living. Right? It's because it mattered to them when they were living that certain things happened to them. That they hold these rights.
Yeah.
And so I really feel the pull of saying, why not say it's their rights, your rights that you had whilst living, but now are getting frustrated posthumously. So it might be that there's some rights that look a bit weird conceived of in this way. Your right that your remains not be defiled, say. That isn't a right you had held whilst living.
Right.
And so how do we make sense of saying that right can be infringed posthumously, but it's a right you have whilst living? But perhaps there are related rights on which this right can be inherited. So a right to be shown respect, say, or a right to bodily integrity. Perhaps the upshot of this right after you're dead is you have a right that remains undefiled. Right. So I think that's a bit inconclusive. So the other thing I wanted to say in answer to this question is what seems to be appealing about taking the second line that you suggested, where we say it's the rights that we held whilst living that are now violated posthumously, is it does avoid a really tricky question. That is, namely, how can I hold rights in virtue of things being good or bad for me when I no longer exist, right? By definition, I'm dead. And what this move says is, well, you, once you're dead, don't hold these rights. You, when you were living, held those rights, and they're just being posthumously affected. So that's an attractive feature of the view. But it does introduce a different tricky question, which you sort of alluded to, which is, how can something that happens to me after I'm dead retrospectively violate the rights I held whilst I was living, in virtue of making my life go worse for me when I was living?
Yeah.
So some people have tried to answer this question. So Joel Feinberg and George Pitcher in the second half of the 20th century took a line at this, and they said, well, what's going on here is that you're harmed when you were living by events that happen to you after you die, because someone's frustrating your preferences after you die, make it the case that you were living with this preference that was never going to be satisfied.
Yeah.
So posthumously, they make it the case that you were sort of doomed to fail. It seems a bit weird to me. The timing is a bit off. It seems that what's bad about destroying my manuscript. Yeah. And it seems that the point at which it's bad to destroy my manuscript is at the point at which you destroy it, not when you're destroying it in 2035 planned me from like 2024 to
to
the day I die. So what I was sort of tempted to do is just embrace the weirdness of thinking stuff can be good or bad for you, and you can hold rights and virtue of that after you no longer exist. That sounds really weird, but we've already seen when we moved away from the hedonistic view of well-being that we've severed this connection between well-being and your experiences. So perhaps it's not so weird that even though you're no longer around experiencing things, things can be good or bad for you. Namely, because you've got these desires that have outlived you, and that's frustrated or promoted, or you've got these aspects of your lives that can be good or bad for you. And so at the point at which that desire is frustrated, or at the point at which that aspect of your life is posthumously frustrated, well, that's the point at which you're made worse off. Sounds weird, but maybe it's the best package of views.
Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So, Joseph Bowen, thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.